G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here. The Copper Golem has opened up a whole new field of storage tech to the wider player base. And in this video, we're going to implement our engineering expertise to maximize the Golem's sorting capabilities. Whether you're an advanced technical redstoner or your average Minecraft player wanting to build a simple item sorter, this is the video for you. So what is the most simple storage system you can think of? Well, that will probably be a random chest in the corner of your house. This works fine to begin with, but at some point you're going to want to take on more ambitious projects. And the items you need for these projects will become increasingly hidden behind a veil of ambiguity. We explored this phenomenon in detail in a previous video titled The Crisis in Storage Tech. If you're interested in listening to me talk about thermodynamics in the context of Minecraft, be sure to give that video a watch. But otherwise, all you need to understand is that random chests with random items makes it harder to get the materials that you need, and thus harder to build things. What you need is a centralized storage system like this one. Actually, this one might be a little bit overkill. Instead, you can begin to utilize the Copper Golem. Now, the behavior of the Copper Golem is a bit involved, but once you understand its behavior, you can start to utilize its abilities more effectively. Depending on whether the golem has an item or not, it will search a 32 block square radius around its current position for a chest to deposit the item, or a copper chest to retrieve an item. The golem's brain will organize nearby containers by their precise distance from the golem's feet position. If multiple containers have exactly the same distance, then the golem will pick a random access order for containers within the same distance group. However, even though the access order can be random, the sequence the golem chooses is locational and will be consistent over time. It's important to note that the golem's distance sorting occurs before the golem considers the path it will take to get to a container. For example, the golem will choose this chest first because it's technically closer to the golem's initial position when its brain sorted the containers, thus completely missing the fact that this container is technically closer when considering pathfinding. Despite this small exception, the golem's pathfinding is still pretty smart and will re-evaluate its targets when they determine that the path is actually blocked. Just make sure that you're careful of how you use trapdoors when building your Copper Golem storages. It's also important to note that the distance sorting is re-evaluated from the golem's current position every time it's finished with a goal, which means you need to pay close attention to the layout and pathing around your storage system if you want to get intended results. Inside the golem's brain is a memory buffer of previous containers the golem has visited. The purpose of this memory buffer is to prevent the golem from backtracking through containers as already checked in the distance sorting. When searching copper chests for an item, the golem will remember up to 10 locations. If it fails to find an item in the 10th chest, it will stop for exactly 7 seconds, then wipe its memory, and start searching again from its new position. The same thing happens if the golem has an item and is searching for a place to put it. On the 10th chest that fails the sorting criteria, the golem stops for 7 seconds before wiping its memory and starting again from its current position. The distance sorting combined with the dynamics of the golem's memory means that if you offer it more than 10 containers that it can pathfind to, the results of which container the golem ends up accessing can become ambiguous and suboptimal. The logic for how the golem manipulates items is a bit confusing at first, but makes perfect sense if you pay close attention. When accessing a copper chest, the golem will attempt to grab up to 16 items from the first available slot. If a slot has less than 16 items, then the interaction will not spill over into adjacent slots. When accessing a chest, the golem will deposit the item if the chest is empty. It will also deposit the item if that item is anywhere inside of the chest. The golem will not deposit the item if there are items present and the item that it's holding is not present. When comparing items, the golem will only consider the type of item and none of its associated data. So variables like custom names, durability on tools, enchantments, and potion effects are all ignored. The last crucial detail we need to fully understand the behavior of the copper golem is the interaction time. When a copper golem opens a container to look inside, the interaction will last for exactly 3 seconds. During this time, no other golem will be able to access the container. This makes the 3-second interaction time the primary bottleneck for how quickly you can sort items using the copper golem. Consider a copper chest filled with items. Each golem can grab up to 16 items per interaction. The interaction time is 3 seconds, so that is 16 items every 3 seconds, giving us about 5.3 items per second, or 19,200 items per hour. That is the maximum sorting speed, assuming a single stackable item type supplied to the copper chest continuously. But realistically, the golems will be sorting a random amount of different item types, meaning the copper chest is more likely to look like this. In this case, the golems are not always grabbing the full 16 items. Then consider that you feed the chest with a hopper. The hopper has its own transfer speed of 2.5 items per second, or 9,000 items per hour. So the hopper now becomes the bottleneck for our sorting system. To get to the bottom of what sorting speeds you can expect given the many variables that can go into a copper golem item sorter, I've set up an experiment that uses this basic layout and measures the resulting sorting speed given 2 variables. The first variable is the number of golems, which we can increase incrementally during the test. Each golem takes an item and checks every chest before depositing the item at the end, where we measure the speed at which it sorts that item. In the copper chest, we feed a single item type at hopper speed, but place a limit on the amount of items that can be taken by the golem at once. For example, the item limit right now is set to 1, but if I go ahead and set it to 10, we're now presenting at least 10 items to the golem, but ensuring that the items are always input at hopper speed. I had this test run automatically for over 7 real-life hours and recorded the results automatically using Carpet Mod's scripting API. And the results were very interesting. These graphs depict the sorting speed given the number of golems and the maximum number of items presented to the golems. You'll note that the graphs get cut off around 9,000 items per hour, where we hit the hopper speed bottleneck. Beneath the bottleneck, we observe a consistent pattern, where the curve is split into 3 dominant regions. The growth phase is when the addition of a golem will simply increase the sorting speed linearly. This is where the addition of golems is most effective. The curve then stagnates in the contention phase. This happens because golems begin to contend with one another over access to the containers. Strangely, this contention phase eventually breaks through into a recovery phase, in which an overwhelming amount of golems begins to increase the sorting speed by a small margin. The ideal maximum is the sorting speed we could get from a golem being able to take the full amount of items every 3 seconds. But what these curves tell us is that it is impossible to ever reach ideal sorting conditions with this layout. We could consider reaching hopper speed as ideal, but if we remove the hopper speed constraint, we find that we still don't reach the maximum sorting speed of 19,200 items per hour. But what about the case of different storage layouts? Well, I also tested what would happen if we doubled the spacing between containers, or kept the golems completely stationary. Comparing the curves directly between layouts, and we see a clear pattern. Allowing the golems to move increases the effects of contention and prevents us from reaching ideal sorting speeds. The further the golems have to move, the greater the effects of contention, and the further from ideal speeds we can obtain. So does this mean that every storage should use this layout because it's the most optimal? In fact, this specific layout was shown by Rapscallion and is a great compromise for a simple but effective storage. However, the drawback of this design is that the items assigned to the container also occupy the space in that container. You can't really scale up the capacity for specific item assignments, and it's very easy to accidentally unassign an item by removing it from the container. My personal preference is for a smarter redstone system that holds onto item assignments using filters. Then additional capacity can be implemented below those filters to hold more items without placing any restrictions on how the player can use those items. You might recognize this storage layout from my previous video where I demonstrated a prototype of the kind of item sorter I would use with the copper golem. Well, since then a lot has happened. I've done my research and I finally feel ready to present my judgment on how to build the ultimate storage using the copper golem. The storage is built from 3 sections. At the bottom we have the input handling, which intelligently allocates items to the sorting stage to prevent overflowing and item loss. In the middle we have the storage section, where the items are stored in silos for each category. At the top is the sorting stage, where the copper golems get to work sorting the items in every category, and you might notice we have returned to using the dustless multi-item filter, which offers many benefits over conventional filters. Previously we determined that dustless filters are easily broken by the copper golem's unpredictable timings. However, since then I've made a crucial innovation to fix the problem and make dustless filters viable. The key insight is that while the golems can input items at a random interval, which eventually triggers the filter at a bad time, leaving it in the incorrect state, this random interval is tied to the golem's interaction time and thus will always be longer than 3 seconds. And in 3 seconds, a hopper will have transferred 7.5 items. So as long as we ensure the golem cannot transfer more than 7 items, the golem will never be able to deposit an item faster than this filter can switch states. This setup effectively simulates the copper golem depositing items at a random interval between 60 and 100 ticks. And as you can see, you can deposit up to 7 items without the dustless filters ever breaking. A really neat mechanism to restrict the item count can be made with this arrangement of hoppers around a double chest. If I place a dispenser below the chest, waterlog the chest, and then dispense a chest boat into the water, we create a mechanism that can precisely deposit a controlled amount of items into the chest every time it's emptied. We then implement this mechanism at every corner junction of the sorting stage where we input items into a copper chest. And what we get is every golem being limited to a precise quantity of items. Now for the final design, I had to bump the limit down to 6 from 7. Because after extensive testing of unload resilience, it was found that filters could fail on 7 items when being unloaded at a bad time. So putting the limit at 6 items makes the dustless filters perfectly robust. The critical drawback is that by restricting the items to 6, we are now capped to the dynamics of this curve for 6 items. Meaning the dustless filter also comes with a speed penalty of only 2/3 hopper speed. So why use a dustless filter? Well, it can have a variable threshold even in adjacent slices, and you can change the threshold really easily, which is a great feature for choosing your own item layouts. The dustless filter can be a little trickier to set up initially, but once you understand how to use it, the extra functionality will come in extremely handy. You will want to build the top and bottom sections of the filter separately for the whole array. Then you can use a button and some redstone wire to flip the states of the upper bulbs. After that is done, you can go through placing upwards observers against the bottom of the droppers and every filter will flip into the correct state. Now whenever you update a comparator, it should flip the state of the corresponding filter. To assign items to a slice, you can use the button to lock the filters and prevent them from responding to inserted items. The mod item scroller is extremely beneficial for manipulating items in containers, and can make this process much easier. I would suggest using dummy blocker items to block off slots in the chest, making it much easier to assign items to the last slots of the chest. Now I have a habit of aligning the items to the back of the chest simply because it looks nice. But if it makes things easier, then only the first slot will need to be empty. Once all your items are inside the chest, you want to re-enable the filters, make sure you have a dummy item in the first slot, and then gradually add items until the filter is triggered. There we go. It's taking out the dummy item, and now whenever we add an item to the first slot, it gets taken out by the filter. Another aspect of the storage which is not obvious from a schematic is how to get the golems in. The only way to create a copper golem is by placing the carved pumpkin on the copper block. However, this also generates the copper chest along with it, which isn't very practical for generating large quantities of golems. Fortunately, it's very easy to make a simple mechanism that lets you place the copper block, break the chest, and drop the golem into place. You won't even need to worry about waxing the golems, because being inside of the vines will prevent them from converting into a statue. The optimal number of golems to place in each sorting wing is 14. We know this because we can look at our sorting curve and find that 14 is around the point we lose efficiency in adding golems. So let's say you have your storage system, and it looks impressive, but the next step is perhaps one of the most difficult barriers to building your ultimate storage. Every player is always left with an annoying question of how to decide on the item layout. You see, the copper golem excels at sorting items into categories. Our chest filters can take up to 53 different items and have them stored together. But deciding which items belong together is an extremely difficult task, and I've spent a lot of time researching solutions. In my last video, I touched on a mathematical algorithm called Louvain clustering. This is essentially a process for mapping out the connections between things. A good example of this is the wiki game, where you start with an article on Wikipedia, and using only links to other articles, try to reach a destination topic. A method like Louvain clustering would use these links between articles to map out clusters of topics that reference each other. So you can imagine taking this concept and instead applying it to Minecraft's items. But then the question is, what criteria should we use to draw connections between items? A really simple approach would be to start with the item IDs. For example, let's look at oak log. The material comes from the oak tree. Therefore, it would make sense to group this item with all other oak items. But it would also make sense to group it with other logs. You'd think that an automated algorithm like the Louvain method could feed on those patterns and produce a decent item layout for you. But whenever I tried this, the algorithms would keep getting stuck on Minecraft's inconsistent taxonomy. For example, pale oak and dark oak would always be grouped together with oak because they all contain oak, despite the fact that our own intuition tells us that these are different materials. Another example is the stones, where you can determine the material of the stone like diorite, andesite, or granite by simply reading the first term in the name. But then, all of a sudden, the first term switches to being polished. Human intervention would always be needed, so I had to make a decision. Either I could lock in my own item layout that only works for me, or I could make a tool that people can use to build their own item layouts using their own biases to make something that truly works for them. Allow me to introduce the Minecraft Item Set Builder. This is a web app I have developed in HTML to make it as accessible as possible for a web browser. Through the app, you are presented with the item catalog containing every survival attainable item as of Minecraft 1.21.10. You also get this workspace where you can create cells representing our multi-item assignments. Each cell represents a double chest with the first slot reserved and 53 slots available for item assignments. We also have some really advanced features to help us sort through the items. The first of which is this search field. We can type in a term like stone, and it will filter out every item containing stone in its name. If we want to be even more specific, we can put an underscore to filter out every item that is explicitly stone. Then let's say we want to create a multi-item category for the overworld stone. We can go up here and select the move all, click on any of the items in the catalog and drag over to the cell. This will move all of the currently filtered items over into the cell. However, of course, we don't want to store end stone with our overworld stone. So I can select the end of a range, hold down shift, select multiple items, click the X on any one of these items, and they'll be removed from the cell and added back to the catalog. I can also do this individually for items that I don't want to be in this cell, for example stone tools and haptics like the stone pressure plate and button. And that way I've created a category with only the overworld stones. Let's also make another category for overworld stones. Let's clear the search field and type in IT. This will now filter out any item containing the term ITE, which includes things like andesite, calcite, diorite. However, you'll notice it also includes a bunch of things like all the white items, item frame, and we don't necessarily want to include these items. For this, we can implement the more advanced filters. This provides a whole range of options to help filter down the items that get shown in the catalog. A handy filter we can use is the category. This is simply the creative category that the items get put in the creative inventory. If we select building blocks, this will filter us down to only the stone variants and maybe block of netherite. We can drag these over to the cell, remove the netherite block, and now we have put andesite, diorite and granite all in the same category. The group filter provides a whole bunch of tags assigned to items through Minecraft's assets. This can have some really specific uses, like for example, if you select bee food, you can filter out all the flowery blocks and then assign those to their own category. The material filter is helpful for filtering items based on what they're crafted from. It is basically a more advanced extension of the search field, because if I just type in something like iron into the search field, we will filter for every item that contains iron in its name, but if I go ahead and type iron in the materials, you'll see we'll also capture items made from iron that don't necessarily have iron in the name. The color filter can be really useful for advanced building techniques, as it can group items by their dominant colors. It uses a HSL color format with sliders for hue, saturation, and luminosity. A really good example of where it comes in handy is with the natural blocks. Let's say I want to make separate categories for green, brown, and grey tones. I can set the hue range to say green hues. I can adjust the saturation to filter out the more muted tones. And then I can assign the greener items to their own category. If I want to get the more muted grey tones, I can reset the filter, reduce the saturation, and as you can see, we're now getting the items that have more grey colours. To ensure that you guys can have the best experience possible in building your ultimate storage, I have been hard at work building my own storage system in survival to put myself into the shoes of a user of the app. And one problem I've identified is how easy it can be to get carried away with assigning items just to find out you do not have access to that item in your current playthrough. To get an idea of how we can solve this problem, go to your game menu, statistics, and press on the items tab. This will effectively list every item that the player has interacted with at some point in a specific world. I had Kikugie build a mod that would fetch the player's stats and download them into a file using a simple command. In the Item Builder app, you go to Advanced Filters, the player stats sort, import stats, and select the file you just downloaded. This will import the player statistics directly into the web app and allow you to sort the item catalog by the player's statistics. You can sort the item catalog by the amount of times you used an item, the amount of times that item was crafted, or by your possession of that item, which is a metric calculated from the amount of times the player picked up the item minus the amount of times the player dropped an item. You also get access to this filter slider. By default, the catalog will display every item in the game but ranked from the largest of the selected statistics to the smallest. For example, clearly I've accumulated a large amount of cobblestone, dirt, and tuff. If I want to only include items that I've interacted with, I can nudge the bottom of the slider from NA to 0, and immediately you can see the amount of items in the catalog jumps to only items that I've interacted with at some point and thus have a statistic included. I can also filter the items further by adjusting the sliders for the most or least significant items in that statistic. Another feature of the app is the ability to export and import item layouts. For example, Here is an item layout that I've prepared for my survival storage. This should give you an idea of what the result of using the app could look like. You can drag cells to rearrange their order. And if you have OCD like me, you can use these buttons to sort the items in the cells based on some intelligent criteria. This button will try to sort the items by their color, while these two buttons will use some smart criteria to try and organize the items. For example, if we go to this cell containing different shapes of blocks like slabs, blocks, and stairs, or the different wood varieties, I can click this button to group the items by the shape of the block, like by putting the slabs together and so on. Or clicking the other button will sort by the inverse of that and group the items by their wood type. It should be noted that the arrangement of items in a cell is completely superficial. However, it can be very pleasing to have the items organized this way. To help with building the layouts in survival, you can press this button in the top right corner to enter a fill level display mode. This will generate dummy quantities of items to set up the filters. If you don't agree with certain choices, you can drag and drop items to substitute those items with more desirable ones. You can even use the same item multiple times to reach the correct fill level for your filter. It is extremely important that you pay attention to these quantities and replicate them in your survival storage exactly. What I consider to be the final unsolved barrier to building your ultimate storage is gathering the items. When doing this step, you'll feel like you'll need a centralized storage just to get the items to build your centralized storage. This task can be incredibly stress-inducing, so here are a few tips and tricks to make the process easier. Firstly, bundles will become your best friend, because what you're going to need is many representations of singular items, which can all be packed into individual bundles. Another useful trick is to make use of Litmatica's material list feature. For this, I've made a fork of Litematica for 1.11.10 which incorporates the ability to load material lists directly from files. In the Item Set Builder app, you can click the export button to download a list of the items from your cells. You can then move this file to your schematics folder. Provided you're using the fork of Litematica that I modified, you can use the Litematica menu, go to load schematics, and from here you can see the files that our app generated. Select the file, press material list, and this will generate a Litematica material list from the item layout. You can access all kinds of features like the info HUD, which keeps track of the items as you run around gathering them. Now unfortunately, one limitation of the info HUD is that it can only display a limited subset of the items you need, so it can be very frustrating being forced to find specific items to clear the list and find more items. This is why in my Litematica fork, I have also implemented a feature that updates the list when you open containers. As you can see, the items in the container just moved to the top of the list. So now we can grab those items, and once Litematica verifies that those items are in our inventory, they'll be cleared from the list, allowing us to see more items. This will even work for items inside of bundles inside of the player's inventory. For example, from the container of one of my filters, if I start picking up all these items and putting them into a bundle, Litematica will automatically register that I'm collecting these items, and once they're in my inventory, they are marked as available, and thus will not be shown on the info HUD. Oh my goodness, now that was a grind. But now that I finally have my storage, I can finally have peace of mind knowing I'll always have somewhere to dump my items. That is until I have to address the items I have not yet assigned in the overflow. But that sounds like a future cubic meter problem. This has been a huge project, where the limitation of good intentions has certainly taken its toll. This specific design might not be your ultimate storage, but I'm hoping that with the tools and knowledge in this video, that I might inspire some confidence in people to have a go at building their ultimate storage system. If you feel like all this work has been of value to you, be sure to give me a like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your ultimate storage experience. You can find links to the world download of my storage design as well as links to the tools shown in this video down in the description. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.